You move through your days like someone trying to pay for groceries with emotions instead of money, hoping the cashier will understand, hoping the world will give you credit for your intentions. And when it doesn't, you feel wronged, misunderstood, maybe even cursed with bad luck. But deep down, you already know the truth. The world responds to outcomes, not feelings. The economy of real life doesn't accept, "I tried." It accepts what lands, what scales, what holds up under pressure. Now forget whatever you're dealing with today. Let's walk through the truth together. You tell yourself you're a logical person. You're not. You're an emotional creature who's learned how to decorate impulses with language that sounds intelligent. Every time you say, "I'll think about it," what you really mean is, "I'm overwhelmed, and I don't want to make the wrong move." Every time you delay a decision, you claim it's because you're being strategic, but you're not. You're negotiating with your own fear. And fear, when left unexamined, becomes the quiet CFO of your entire life, approving and denying decisions based on comfort, not direction. You've built a habit of trusting your emotional weather as if it were a compass. When you feel motivated, you take action. When you feel insecure, you freeze. When you feel excited, you start projects. When you feel uncertain, you let them die. Your business ideas, your career growth, your financial plans, they all live or die by the temperature of your emotions in a given moment. You call this intuition. But intuition is pattern recognition, not mood swings. And that's where the trap begins. You assume your feelings are valuable data. Sometimes they are. But most of the time, they're noise, static from childhood stories, social comparison, ego friction, and your own craving for validation. This is the emotional economy at work, the belief that your internal experience should somehow influence external outcomes. You keep depositing feelings and expecting returns, like stuffing gratitude into a vending machine and wondering why no snacks come out. The truth is simpler. The world doesn't pay for emotional effort. It pays for consistency, for boundaries, for execution, for the ability to stay the course when your feelings try to pull you in 12 directions at once. You want success to feel good, to feel aligned, to feel like something you're emotionally ready for. But that's not how it works. Success is indifferent to your readiness. A market doesn't care if you're anxious. A client doesn't care if you're insecure. Your bank account doesn't care if you're overwhelmed. These systems aren't cruel, they're neutral. You're the one projecting cruelty because neutrality feels like rejection to someone who relies on emotional confirmation instead of values. You confuse emotional relief with progress. You avoid hard decisions because saying, "maybe later," feels safer in the moment. You think it's patience, but it's boundary collapse with yourself. The more you rely on maybe, the more your life becomes a graveyard of half-built bridges. Connections, opportunities, projects, relationships, all abandoned because they didn't align with your shifting inner weather. And the worst part? You think this makes you thoughtful. You think being cautious is proof of maturity. But emotional caution is not the same as strategic discipline. One protects your comfort. The other protects your direction. You've been choosing comfort for so long that you've convinced yourself it's wisdom. Look at the inflation effect in your own behavior. Every time you say yes emotionally, yes to distractions, yes to fear, yes to validation chasing, you devalue your long-term goals. Your priorities lose worth because you give yourself away too easily to whatever feeling shouts the loudest. You don't need more motivation. You need a value system strong enough to regulate your emotional economy, a system where your decisions aren't puppets of how you feel in the moment. Because right now, your feelings run your life like unpaid interns, chaotic, overwhelmed, overstimulated, and absolutely unqualified. This is where the unraveling begins. You don't realize how much maybe has cost you. Not the polite version you say to others, the internal one you whisper to yourself every time responsibility feels heavier than your self-belief. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe when things calm down. Maybe when I feel ready. These maybes pile up like unopened bills on a kitchen counter, quietly accumulating interest, while you convince yourself you're being careful, thoughtful, measured. But maybe is not caution. Maybe is emotional procrastination dressed as maturity. Every maybe is a delay in the real economy of your life, where time is the only currency you can't refund. You treat it like something renewable because emotions make you feel infinite. When you're anxious, time feels slow. When you're excited, time feels abundant. And when you feel overwhelmed, time feels like a prison you can't escape. But none of these sensations are real measurements. They're emotional distortions. Meanwhile, reality keeps moving. Competitors move, opportunities expand or close, markets shift. Your window gets smaller while your self-narrative gets more poetic. You keep imagining a future version of yourself who will finally be decisive. But decisive people aren't decisive because they're confident. They're decisive because they act despite emotional interference. They know the emotional economy is a liar. They know if they wait until they feel ready, they'll be dead in the water. You, on the other hand, keep banking on this fantasy that one day the clouds will part and you'll suddenly become the kind of person who handles everything perfectly. The irony? Maybe trains your brain to avoid reality. Each time you say it, you reinforce a habit loop. Discomfort, delay, relief. And relief is addictive. That's how learned helplessness is born. Not from one traumatic moment, but from thousands of tiny retreats, thousands of moments where you chose emotional relief over directional clarity. You become conditioned to believe that discomfort is a threat rather than a signal, a stop sign rather than a compass. This is why people fail in business. Not because they're dumb, not because they lack talent, but because they live in emotional time, not real time. Emotional time is slow, stretched, filled with, "I'll get to it later." Real time is indifferent. By the time you've finished calming down your nervous system, the opportunity has already moved on. This is the reciprocity breakdown in action. You expect life to wait for you because you've been patient with yourself. But patience with yourself does not obligate the world to reciprocate. And then there's the sunk cost fallacy hiding behind your maybes. You stay in unproductive jobs, unprofitable ideas, stagnant partnerships, because you've already spent so much time and emotional energy on them. You think, if I quit now, everything I did will be wasted. But the real waste isn't quitting, it's continuing. You confuse endurance with integrity. You confuse suffering with loyalty. You confuse hesitation with depth. You keep thinking that your emotional investment should magically turn into tangible results, as if the universe will eventually pity you and deliver something back. This is the gratitude paradox applied to your own life. You think the world owes you appreciation because you've been patient, loyal, hopeful. But reality doesn't run on emotional gratitude. It runs on action-based feedback loops. When nothing changes, nothing changes. Your maybe is not a harmless delay. It's a silent thief. It steals traction. It steals clarity. It steals years. And the more you let it steal, the more normal the robbery feels. You call it burnout, bad timing, bad luck. But what you're really describing is the cost of indecision accumulating interest. Look at your life the way an economist looks at a failing business. Too many emotional expenses, not enough value-driven assets. Your emotional costs are bloated. Your discipline reserves are empty. Your boundaries are underfunded. And your operational decisions depend on the emotional weather. Sunny days mean productivity. Rainy days mean collapse. A business that runs like that goes bankrupt. So does a life. You walk through life carrying a stack of invisible contracts, agreements no one else has seen, let alone signed. You believe that if you're generous, people will reciprocate. If you're patient, life will reward you. If you show loyalty, others will match your devotion. These contracts feel noble, almost sacred. But they're emotional documents, drafted by hope and sealed with fear. And when the world fails to honor them, you call it betrayal instead of misalignment. This is one of the core psychological traps that keeps you poor. You operate based on emotional agreements instead of actual incentives. You assume the universe runs on fairness rather than structure, reciprocity, or boundaries. You believe effort should automatically translate to outcomes. But the economy of life doesn't care about emotional IOUs. It cares about leverage. It cares about clarity. It cares about the incentives that shape behavior, not the feelings you attach to them. This misunderstanding shows up everywhere. You work overtime thinking the company will appreciate your sacrifice. But appreciation isn't a currency in corporate ecosystems. Results and negotiation power are. You stay loyal to a failing project because you assume hard work will eventually tip the scales. But results don't emerge from loyalty. They emerge from alignment, timing, and strategy. You invest emotional energy into people who can't reciprocate, believing your consistency will inspire theirs. But emotional consistency doesn't obligate reciprocity. You keep forming silent clauses like, I helped you, so you'll remember. I supported you, so you'll show up for me later. I care deeply, so life will eventually pay me back. But these aren't contracts, they're wishes. Invisible contracts collapse because they rely on a fantasy that your internal world should naturally influence the external world. You think your emotional effort has economic weight, like some kind of spiritual currency that accumulates interest over time. But emotional effort only matters to you. Others respond to what benefits them, not what honored your internal struggle. This is why you feel exploited so often, not because the world is malicious, but because you keep assuming your emotional generosity has market value, and when it doesn't, you feel robbed. But you weren't robbed. You mispriced yourself. You assigned value to things the other party wasn't buying. It's the emotional version of stocking a store with products no one asked for, and then wondering why nobody pays. And then you blame the customers. Your invisible contracts also sabotage your boundaries. You say yes because you expect a return, but you disguise it as kindness. You stay silent about your needs because you assume they'll be noticed. You tolerate disrespect because you expect people to eventually recognize your value. This is the emotional economy failing again, expecting a high return on an investment nobody else agreed to participate in. Boundary collapse always follows. When you don't communicate your expectations, you let resentment fill the empty space. And resentment is expensive. It drains your energy, inflates your emotional debt, and distracts you from any pursuit requiring focus or courage. You become financially poor because you're emotionally overextended. You spend your inner resources on misunderstandings, misaligned relationships, and people who didn't know they were part of your emotional bookkeeping. The worst part? Your invisible contracts extend to your relationship with yourself. You keep telling yourself that if you endure long enough, something will change. If you keep trying, clarity will magically appear. If you stay hopeful, opportunities will show up. But hope is not a strategy. Endurance is not a plan. Waiting is not progress. You hold yourself hostage with the same emotional agreements you impose on the world. Contracts built on the fantasy that emotional effort alone should compensate for lack of direction. But emotional effort without boundaries creates erosion. It wears you down. It devalues you. It makes you emotionally generous but strategically bankrupt. You're not losing because you're weak or unlucky. You're losing because you're operating in an economy where your emotional currency is worthless, and you're still trying to pay with it. Your life didn't fall apart in one dramatic moment. It eroded, slowly, quietly, like a shoreline losing inches every year. Not because you didn't care, but because you cared in all the wrong ways. You kept giving pieces of yourself to situations that never deserved them. You kept showing up for people who only valued the convenience of your presence, not the substance of your effort. And you called this loyalty, compassion, or being a good person, when in reality, it was self-worth erosion disguised as virtue. You've spent years believing that saying yes makes you valuable, that being agreeable makes you safe, that overextending yourself makes you indispensable. But that's not value. That's emotional inflation. The more freely you give yourself away, the cheaper you become in the eyes of others. Not because people are cruel, but because this is how humans subconsciously interpret abundance. When something is everywhere, it appears less valuable. If you walked into a grocery store and saw gold bars stacked next to discount cereal, you'd question the gold, not the cereal. That's how people view your time, energy, and attention. Constantly available, suspiciously cheap, infinitely renewable. And you wonder why no one treats you like an investment. Your emotional generosity turns into a liability when it has no boundaries. You secretly hope that being endlessly available will make people appreciate you more. But the gratitude paradox works against you. The more you give, the less others feel obligated to reciprocate. Gratitude fades quickly when the cost of receiving is zero. Your presence becomes background noise. Your sacrifices become routine. Your effort becomes invisible because you've trained everyone, including yourself, to see it as the default setting. And every time you tell yourself, "It's fine, I don't mind," a part of you believes it. A part of you genuinely wants to be the flexible one, the reliable one, the easy one. But another part, the part you silence, notices the imbalance. It notices when people don't show up for you the way you show up for them. It notices when your needs go unacknowledged. It notices when the emotional economy collapses, when the reciprocity breakdown becomes too obvious to ignore. Instead of confronting this, you do what emotionally driven people do. You double down. You give even more. You become even more available, even more accommodating, even more self-sacrificing, hoping the increased investment will finally trigger the return you've been silently waiting for. But this only increases the imbalance. Emotional overextension does not create loyalty. It creates dependency or indifference. And here's the brutal truth you avoid. You're terrified of raising your standards because you're afraid people will leave. You're afraid that if you stop overgiving, you'll discover how little others were willing to offer in the first place. You're afraid that if you enforce boundaries, your relationships, your job, your friendships, even your identity, will start to fall apart. And maybe they will. But if a relationship collapses when you stop abandoning yourself, it wasn't a relationship. It was a convenient arrangement built on your silence. This is why your self-worth erodes. You keep trading authenticity for belonging. You keep choosing comfort over clarity. You keep using emotional labor as a substitute for personal value, like someone trying to fix a sinking boat by pouring more water into it. The more you sacrifice, the more your identity becomes anchored in being needed rather than being respected. You become the emotional equivalent of a gym membership people sign up for and forget. Useful, available, but not truly valued. And every time you tolerate this dynamic, you reinforce the belief that your worth depends on how much you can endure, not how much you can choose. But endurance without boundaries is not resilience. It's self-neglect practiced until it feels normal. This erosion doesn't make you a victim of other people. It makes you a victim of your own emotional economics. You've built a life relying on feelings, guilt, fear, hope, instead of values, boundaries, clarity, direction. And any structure built on emotional sand eventually collapses. You just never expected it to collapse on you. Failure doesn't arrive like a storm. It arrives like a habit, quiet, repetitive, unchallenged. You think failure is an event, some dramatic collapse you'll see coming from miles away. But failure grows in the spaces where you let your emotional reflexes run your life. It grows in the comfort of routine hesitation. It grows in the pauses you justify with, "I'm just not ready yet." It grows in the cycles you repeat because they feel familiar, even when they're destroying you. You don't fail because you lack talent. You fail because you've practiced failure as a lifestyle. Learned helplessness doesn't come from disaster. It comes from repetition. Your habit of stepping back instead of stepping forward, waiting instead of deciding, reacting instead of directing. You've conditioned yourself to believe that discomfort is dangerous, that uncertainty is a sign to retreat, that progress should feel like confidence instead of friction. So you avoid any path that doesn't flatter your emotions, and the more you avoid, the more powerless you feel. The more powerless you feel, the more avoidance becomes your default mode of existence. This is failure as a learned habit, the autopilot of emotional decision-making. Look at your patterns. Every time a new opportunity appears, you calculate its emotional weight rather than its strategic value. You think, "What if I'm not good enough?" Instead of, "What's the next step?" You prioritize the preservation of your self-image over the pursuit of results. You treat your feelings like fragile collectibles, carefully protected, never challenged, and then wonder why your life doesn't expand. You treat rejection like a personal verdict. You treat risk like a moral danger. You treat discomfort like a sign that something is wrong instead of something is beginning. This is why you stay stuck. You've mistaken emotional ease for safety and emotional difficulty for threat. But the truth is brutally simple. The path to anything worthwhile is paved with decisions that do not feel good at the time. You want growth without friction, progress without pressure, wealth without uncertainty, direction without loss. But every meaningful choice comes with a cost, and your emotional economy is too fragile to pay it. This fragility shows up in your relationship with discipline. You don't lack discipline because you're lazy. You lack discipline because you've trained your brain to prioritize emotional comfort over long-term values. Every time you choose relief over direction, you reinforce the belief that you cannot handle life unless it feels good first. And so, you wait. You wait for courage, for clarity, for confidence, as if these qualities descend magically on people who are worthy. But confidence is not a prerequisite. It's a byproduct. It grows after you act, not before. Emotional people get this backward. They try to feel confident before acting, which means they never act. And then there's loss aversion, the psychological mechanism that keeps you chained to mediocrity. You cling to what you already have, even when it's destroying you, because losing it feels more painful than gaining something better. So you protect the job you hate, the relationships that drain you, the habits that keep you small. You cling to them like someone clinging to a sinking raft, insisting that staying afloat counts as progress. But surviving is not thriving. Enduring is not evolving. Your entire life becomes shaped by this one fear, the fear of losing what's already hurting you. This is how emotional living traps you. You become loyal to your limitations because they feel familiar. You keep repeating the same choices because they require the least emotional friction. You crawl into the same versions of yourself every morning because you know exactly how they feel, even if you hate them. But a life built on emotional autopilot cannot lead to anything beyond survival. It certainly cannot lead to wealth, creation, independence, or direction. Those things emerge from values, boundaries, principles, long-term thinking, uncomfortable consistency, not from the emotional fluctuations that shape your day. Failure, then, isn't a curse. It's a routine, one you've perfected through repetition. But the routine only continues if you keep choosing it. You've spent most of your life trying to negotiate with your emotions, hoping they would eventually guide you toward something stable. But emotions were never meant to be your steering wheel. They're weather, temporary, shifting, unpredictable. Values are the map, boundaries are the guardrails, and clarity is the engine. When you build your life on those, you stop collapsing every time the emotional wind changes direction. The truth isn't here to shame you. It's here to remind you that you're not powerless. You're not broken. You're simply conditioned to rely on feelings that were never designed to carry the weight of your future. You can unlearn that. Slowly, quietly, intentionally. By choosing direction over comfort, boundaries over guilt, consistency over impulse. You don't need permission to reclaim your life. You just need to stop outsourcing your decisions to the part of you that panics, hesitates, and bargains. Wealth, emotional or financial, begins when you treat yourself as someone worth protecting, not sacrificing. Take a breath. Let the noise settle. You already know what needs to be done next.